Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this panel session entitled Globalization in the Crosshairs. I think that's the politically correct, slightly optimistic title. I would probably call it, Are we sliding back into protectionism and nationalism? Is it back to the future like the 1930s? And joining me today is a terrific group of people to talk about these issues. On my far right, your left, is Steve Ciobo, Minister of Trade and Tourism and Investment from Australia. Next to him is Brad DeLong, Professor of Economics at Berkeley, one of my favorite economic bloggers. On my left, your immediate right, is John Hagel, Managing Director of Deloitte. Next to him is Alejandro Ramirez, who is CEO of Cinépolis, a large Mexican media group, who's also chairman of the Mexican Business Council. And at the very end is Steve Schwarzman, a man known very well to most of you, CEO of Blackstone and president of the Strategy and Policy Forum for the White House. So, a great combination of people to talk about globalization, nationalism, protectionism, and the impact for business and the economy. But I'd like to start with you, Steve, since you are now in this elevated role, effectively speaking for business across America at the White House. You have built your career very much on the wave of globalization. Globalization has been good to you. Do you regard the president as a protectionist?
I think the way the president looks at himself would be to sort of someone who sets the table with equivalent tariff and other duties, so that globalization goes ahead, but it does it from the perspective of in effect, a certain type of equality, so that when you have the United States charging 1/3 duties and tariffs compared to, sort of the 3 times that for the other country we're dealing with. What I think the administration's saying is, why don't either you come down to the same level we are, or we'll go up to the same level you are, and then let's let trade expand. And so it's really these, in some cases, enormous differences, and as well as in some cases, non-tariff barriers that make it very difficult for us to import, export our products to these other countries, where it's sort of looked at, from the perspective of how did we get into this situation? Right. Why aren't people fundamentally equivalent, and the best products win, or the best services win? And so what you're seeing is an attempt for, sometimes they call it reciprocity or equality, and then, sort of continue with globalization. So right now, the U.S. Basically has the lowest, fully landed tariff borders, depending on how people look at this, tariff plus VAT, pretty much in the world. It happened because of the U.S. dominance after World War II, where we had 75% of global GDP. And it's just been allowed to more or less continue. So it's not to avoid or dampen, in that sense, sort of the trade and globalization and the stuff we're all familiar with.
So, but do you, around that table of the President's Strategy and Policy Council, do you strongly support these calls to renegotiate NAFTA, or are you at all concerned that this is part of an anti-globalization backlash that could actually end up damaging you?
Well, it is interesting that I was at the G20 in Hangzhou And President Xi gave a big speech about, sort of the general anti-trade, and everybody who measures these things has seen trade constricting around the world. So I guess you could look at it, Gillian, in a few different ways. One, just as a simple correction for equivalence. And two, why is it coming up now? And I think, that's just a guess, right? That's a theory. Why is it coming up now? And these types of issues are being raised around the world. But really, it's an equivalence issue. This would all go away if barriers were more or less the same everywhere, and we wouldn't be having the panel.
Okay, so it's not protectionism, it's equivalence. That's clearly going to be the new buzzword in Washington, equivalence. Alejandro, from where you're sitting...
Let me say it this way. If it was the reverse, all these tariffs were upside down, what would other people think?
Well, let's ask them. Alejandro, you come from Mexico, which...
Just as a curious item.
Well, it's a great question to ask. I'm going to ask everyone on the panel. But Alejandro, sitting in Mexico, do you look at what's happening in Washington as an enlightened policy of equivalence, or does it seem a bit more ominous to you? How do you read the current mood towards globalization and trade?
Well, we are very concerned in the Mexican private sector with what we do perceive as a protectionist rhetoric in Washington. The fact that on day one the U.S. withdrew from TPP. The last week there was, as you all know, a leak saying that the White House was preparing an executive order to withdraw the U.S. from NAFTA. That same day, it was. President Trump spoke with President Peña and with Prime Minister Trudeau, so we're continuing on the path of renegotiating the trade deal. But we are concerned because we think that NAFTA has been unduly vilified. I mean, we think that NAFTA has brought overall many more benefits to all three countries than the cost that the trade deal has brought. And trade has more than tripled in the three countries, and just bilaterally between the U.S. and Mexico has increased more than sixfold since 1994. And Mexico has become the number 2 destination for U.S. exports. We trade over $520 billion US dollars every year, and we buy over $236 billion of U.S. goods every year. So around 6 million U.S. jobs depend on trade with Mexico. And of course, Mexico has also benefited enormously, from trading with the U.S. But if we look at specific sectors, for instance, over 22 years ago, when the trade deal was going to come into effect, one of the most sensitive areas was agricultural markets on both countries, the U.S. and Mexico. And today, some of the biggest beneficiaries of the trade deal are the U.S. corn growers of the Midwest and the Mexican growers of fruits and vegetables. And so we're actually exploring very intelligently the relative comparative advantage of each country. And I think NAFTA has allowed us to strengthen the supply chains of North America and has allowed us to strengthen the competitiveness of the region so that we can produce more competitively vis-a-vis other regions of the world.
So when you hear someone like Steve Schwarzman saying, along with the White House, what's needed is equivalence, we need to basically make sure that everybody plays on a level playing field, do you think that's fair, or do you think that's simply protectionism under a new guise?
Well, no, I think that maybe, part of what Steve was referring to is a policy towards other countries that do not have a trade deal with the U.S. and that may have disparate tariff rates. But Mexico had, our average tariff was much higher than the U.S. tariff back in 1994. And we brought it down basically to zero, both countries. But of course, the U.S. average tariff was below 5%. The Mexican average tariff was above 20%. So I don't know with other countries because I don't know the specifics. But I do know that at least with Mexico, I mean, we're dealing at a level playing field, and yet, the U.S. government has threatened repeatedly to withdraw from the deal. I do think, however, there's room for modernizing NAFTA. I mean, it's a 22-year-old deal. There are parts of the economy that didn't exist back then. E-commerce didn't exist. I think there's room for strengthening intellectual property rights, room for strengthening biotech, other things that we can add on labor, environment, anti-corruption. So there's room for modernizing it, but I think to call it, the worst deal ever for the U.S., I think it's, I don't think it's an accurate description of NAFTA.
Right, right. I mean, just while we're on NAFTA, I'll come across the TPP in a minute, but John, you talk to a lot of CEOs, a lot of different companies. How concerned are they about rising protectionism, equalization, trade modernization, whatever you want to call it? I mean, do you think we're in the middle of a sort of bigger protectionist backlash, and is that going to hurt companies that you talk to?
My sense is there's an increasing anxiety about the fact that we're at a pivot point in terms of public policy and how the world's going to evolve. And I think it reflects the paradox of globalization, which is that at one level, globalization is creating expanding economic opportunity around the world. And at another level, it's creating mounting performance pressure on all of us. It's intensifying competition. At the individual level, we face the prospect of loss of jobs, and if we don't lose the jobs, we face the prospect of wages coming down because of international competition. At the corporate level, we have increasing competitive pressure globally. And actually, we've spent time, I run a research center called the Center for the Edge, and we've looked at what we call the big shift, which are the long-term forces that are reshaping the global economy. And the one metric that we think illustrates this mounting performance pressure, actually, if I can show slide 1, we looked at return on assets for all public companies in the United States from 1965 until today. If you look at return on assets for all public companies in the US, it's basically collapsed over a period of decades. We have short-term cycles that correspond to the economic cycles, but the long-term trend is very clear, and there is no sign of it leveling off, certainly no sign of it turning around. And our belief is that is an indicator not only of mounting performance pressure, but of the increasing inability of our institutions to respond to that pressure. This is public companies, but based on the research we've done, we believe all institutions, educational institutions, government institutions, NGOs are facing a similar kind of challenge.
I mean, on that basis, it's going to hit zero in about 2030, isn't it?
This is not a sustainable proposition. So clearly, something is going to have to change, and our belief is, hopefully, being an optimist from Silicon Valley, I'd like to believe this is going to be a catalyst to force us to reassess all our institutions. And by the way, one of the key indicators of the failure of our institutions is the trust metrics. I mean, we have studies after studies showing declining trust in every institution, not just companies, not just banks, not just government, every institution around the world, trust is collapsing. If that's not an indicator of a problem, what is? And our belief is it is the problem that we are unable to respond to the mounting performance pressure and unable to take advantage of the expanding opportunity that is actually created by globalization.
Right. Well, I'm going to come back later on and ask you what can be done, because that obviously clearly is a big question, and part of the point of these conferences is to talk about what can actually be done. Yes. But before I do, I'd like to turn to Brad, who has also come armed with some nice, snappy charts. Brad, do you want to put this in a sort of longer-term historical context?
Okay, let's go since 1800. First globalization.
Competitive
Trade
history.
between capital and resource-rich countries and regions, and huge amounts of migration of finance and labor to the resource-rich. Globalization retreat. Faster progress in mass production than in transport makes it efficient to bring production back home. combined with the fact that the enormous recessions and depressions of the interwar period produced large pressure on governments to keep their jobs at home and engage in beggar-thy-neighbor policies. After World War II, the second globalization, the enormous expansion of North-North intra-industry trade, in which rich countries trade relatively narrow segments of industrial markets to each other, the thing that won Paul Krugman his Nobel Prize, followed by green hyperglobalization. North-South low-wage trade, in which the global South's advantages is low wages, which can now be applied to industrial-scale production because of the success at constructing intercontinental value chains, of which perhaps the first example is the US-Mexico division of labor in automobiles, that my friends on the right and my friends on the left, who feared NAFTA in 1992, said it was going to kill the US auto industry. It didn't. By outsourcing the most labor-intensive parts of auto production and assembly to Mexico, GM and Ford now find themselves in much better competitive positions vis-a-vis BMW, Toyota, and company than they would had we not done NAFTA.
But the question is, if you look at that chart, you have that lovely green arrow heading up towards the heavens, looking like it's going to go upwards forever. The last time I saw charts like that was in 2007, the first time in 2007,
Yes.
before the credit crisis. And, I've seen other charts showing what's happened in the last 150 years to do with the credit cycle, to do with banking pay, which go up and down. So I guess the question I really have, when I look at that, and I look at what we've just seen from John in terms of the return on assets collapsing, what makes you think that green arrow is going to keep going up and not suddenly start going down again?
Well, it's always dangerous to make predictions, especially about the future. But yes, in an era of secular stagnation, when central banks' interest rates are kissing zero for large periods of time, and governments are loath to expand their purchases, perhaps one of the few tools left to a government is to try to redirect its own spending to its own goods whenever it finds itself short of jobs. And yes, low wages are going to become a much less important player in the global division of labor as robots come and as the labor productivity in manufacturing continues to soar upward. China is almost sure to be the last country that follows the successful industrialization recipe of growing a lot richer by exporting low-wage manufacturers to the industrial core, because after China, low-wage, simple, first-line manufacturers just aren't going to need enough workers to produce them for it to be worth anyone's while.
Right. Okay, well that's not entirely, that is not encouraging. And on that note, it seems like a good moment to turn to Australia. You are in the position of being the only elected official here, the only government official on the panel, so you can single-handedly represent governments around the world.
Sure.
Whereas Steve is single-handedly representing business, or rather American business. How do you read the current mood? I mean, do you think we're in the grip of an inexorable slide towards protectionism? Do you see that things like TPP unraveling as part of that trend, or are you a bit more optimistic?
I'm more optimistic, but I was listening to the remarks that Steve made earlier, and I'll contrast them with some of Australia's experience. In the 1980s, Australia unilaterally reduced our tariff barriers. Most goods coming into Australia have zero tariffs or at a maximum of 5%. We've got, of course, free trade agreements with many countries, which mean there's no tariff barriers at all. And we're constantly putting pressure on non-tariff measures to make sure that they're reduced over time. Now, we're in our 26th year of continuous economic growth, which is pretty rare for a highly developed economy. And in fact, we're the longest growth period that any developed economy's ever experienced. Now, I'm not saying that's all a consequence of us having removed tariff barriers, but we know that they distort not only trade, but they distort the efficient allocation of capital. So our experience as a country has been that trade is driving, in many respects, and we see it especially over the last 12 to 24 months in our growth numbers, trade is really driving our economy, and it's also driving employment. One of the points that people often remark to me is they say, well, Australia seems to have a different view of trade than do a lot of other countries. In particular, they'll focus on, for example, European countries. And my observation is to say, well, that may be the case, but one of the reasons why that is the case is because in Australia, if you look at those industries that are particularly protected or subsidised, they tend to be in the agricultural sector. You'll see it with the Europeans, and you also see it here in the United States. In Australia, we don't do that. And in fact, it's actually been our ag sector that has enjoyed the fact that we've got beneficial market access, preferential market access to the fast-growing North Asian powerhouse economies of Japan, China and Korea, which have really underscored big increases in price for ag products coming from Australia. So I think there's quite a different view there because we had a lot of these battles 30 years ago, quite frankly, and it caused pain, it caused disruption. But now we've seen, at the end of what is our 26th year, we've seen the benefits of having taken those decisions.
So if the White House is essentially saying that it's not going to engage in multilateral deals as it has in the past, if TPP has essentially been torpedoed by the White House in terms of American participation, are you willing to simply say, well, the Americans are still being protectionist, let them get on with it, we are going to go forward with, say, China, and do TPP by ourselves?
Well, I certainly think that there's a tremendous benefit from the TPP. So Australia's position is to continue to pursue all options that we possibly can to bring the TPP into effect. Now, as it's currently constructed, by definition, the TPP can't come into force without the USA. But there's opportunity for the remaining 11 countries to come together, and we did that recently in Vina del Mar in Chile to have a conversation about the future for the TPP. Now, we could make a minor tweak to the TPP agreement so that it can still come into force without the United States if need be. That's what we're pursuing. I know that I don't speak on their behalf, but I know a similar view is held by New Zealand, by Canada. I think if ultimately the big player in all this will be Japan, and I was in Japan 2 weeks ago and was particularly pleased that the Japanese government has given some indication that they're very open to considering a TPP 11. Now, in time, whether China or the UK or any other country wants to join, well, that'll be a decision for them in due course. But I think it would be a big missed opportunity for us not to do everything we can to have the TPP come into effect.
And are you willing to take the leadership in that role?
Yeah, absolutely. Australia, New Zealand and Canada have been at the forefront of this discussion.
Right. And just before I turn back to Steve, because I'd like to ask his reaction to this, do you regard it as being wiser now to spend more time focused on building links with, say, China than America, given the way that politics is developing in America?
For a long time, Australia's history was that we considered ourselves a European country stuck in the wrong part of the world. Yeah. The amazing thing is good fortune smiled upon us because we now live in the fastest growing part of the planet. And so we have done a number of things. I mean, Australia is, I think, we're reasonably pragmatic. I mean, of course, we're a strong ally of the United States. We're good friends with Japan, good friends with Korea, good friends with China. Now, traditionally, they haven't all gotten along. But we've been able to manage that process pretty effectively. So we're not putting all our eggs in one basket. We continue to have a diversified approach. We know who our friends are with the United States, but we're focused on doing deals that, I'm focused as a trade minister on doing deals that are good for our country.
Well, spoken like a diplomat or a politician. Steve, I'm curious. Did you support TPP last year?
I did. I thought it was a good thing. I'm sort of, believe in globalization. It was a shame that Democrats didn't want to do it.
I'm not sure that's quite how history would write the books, but anyway.
I mean, that is what happened. And
do you think it's a shame that the current administration doesn't want to do it?
Well, I think it was DOA, actually. And the philosophy that the current group has, I should say, I'm like in the private world. I'm not a government official, so I sort of speak for myself.
That means you can speak freely.
But the theory that the current administration has is that bilateral deals are better than multilateral deals, and the way they come about that is what they say is pretend you have a group of 15 countries, and you cut a deal with country number one. And they want certain things from you, and you want certain things for them. And you always hate giving up what you give up. But you give it up because the balance makes sense. And then you go to country number 2, and they want different things. And you cut a deal with them where you're giving them something you don't want. And you go to country 3, and let's make pretend they don't want anything that country number 1 and 2 did. So you have to now be giving up different things to each one. But in a multilateral deal, you give the same deal you didn't want to give to number 1, and the different one number 2, the different one number 3, you give it to 15 people.
But
now,
NAFTA is the ultimate bilateral or trilateral deal.
Now, their view is, why would I give something away to the worst deal I make with each one to everyone? And why don't I just make the deal I would have made with country number 1 with country number 1, do another deal with number 2. So as it's been explained to me, that when you do that, you sometimes can get other benefits, from the whole group on softer issues, whether they're labor issues and other issues. But the current administration says, I just want to trade with each one, do the best deal I can, and I'd like to do deals with every one of these countries.
But doesn't it worry you? I mean, because if Australia, Canada, China, Japan press ahead with TPP, they will have something pre-packaged, ready to go, ready to rock and roll very fast. I mean, the idea of the administration then trying to do negotiations with each of those 11 countries could be time-consuming. It could essentially leave American companies perhaps at a disadvantage. Does that worry you?
Well,
I can see Brad's
I'm not a trade representative.
Okay, the professor.
Okay?
Well, no,
I cede to anyone who is. However, I haven't found anybody yet who takes the explanation that I've given, and I've checked with the head of multilateral organizations. That is sort of the way it works. And so this group just doesn't want to take the one bad deal and give it to all 15, and the second one and give it to all 15 people in a group. And you could make the case, I guess, logically, that makes some sense. You could make that case, and that's what they're pursuing.
The professor is dying to come in.
Steve Schwarzman is a brilliant genius, and the organization he has played a principal part in building will outstrip even Warren Buffett's career in terms of its alpha generation for its investors over generations. Right? It's a magnificent capitalist accomplishment in finance of astonishing magnitude. And yet the argument Steve is making now against TPP is indeed the ultimate argument for NAFTA, for a focused, comprehensive bilateral or trilateral engagement. And it was NAFTA that, according to first son-in-law Jared Kushner, Trump was on the edge of abrogating 6 days ago, and Jared is reported to have said, if he had abrogated it, we would have wound up in a good place. The reason that Steve gave for wanting to get tougher on trade is because of asymmetric non-tariff barriers. But I am not aware of any non-tariff barriers, significant non-tariff barriers between the United States and Mexico or Canada. Indeed, the only one I remember coming up when NAFTA was being negotiated was Canada's demand for a cultural carve-out, so that its radio stations and other things could continue to give priority to Canada-themed entertainment of one sort or another. One principal example of which was, for some reason, Lenny Kravitz's song, American Woman, Stay Away From Me.
And presumably a lot of French language Canadian entertainment too. Yeah. But I mean, are you essentially arguing that a world where you're moving towards, bilateral deals instead of multilateral is more dangerous?
It's more complicated. Right? You have to have that you either have one deal or you have n times n minus 1 over 2 deals. And then you have to be very, very careful and very, very intricate in terms of keeping track of what goods go where when. how much of stuff coming in from Mexico, because Mexico has made a TPP deal with Australia, would come in under the aegis of Mexico and thus escape the normal tariffs and the normal barriers that are in the single deal that you've struck between the United States and Australia. Keeping track of that is an almost insuperable administrative task, and I think is one of the reasons that Friedrich von Hayek was always very down on central planning of any form. That very soon, when you try to micromanage things at any kind of detailed level with the government level, with the G20, you would have 195 different trade agreements if you did them all bilaterally. It would be a wonderful thing for trade lawyers and those who could actually deploy large numbers of analysts in order to figure out where the asymmetries and loopholes were, could make significant alpha. But I don't think it would be good for the world economy.
Steve, how do you feel about moving towards more bilateral deals?
Well, we keep the full suite. I mean, I'm prepared to pursue a bilateral deal. I'm prepared to pursue a multilateral, a plurilateral, to do regional deals. It's not that there's going to be one size fits all. You cut the cloth to suit. And in that sense, there are a lot of benefits that flow. I mean, the holy grail is, as far as I'm concerned, are multilaterals. Because multilaterals apply one common set of rules across all countries. And the biggest beneficiaries, if you have, for example, the TPP, the biggest beneficiaries from the TPP are the small to medium-sized guys. I mean, the big guys can always compete, right? They can hire the bevy of consultants and others to make sure that their rules of origin and all those things comply. But it's the little guys who can't. If you've got 10 different deals with 10 different sets of rules, the small to medium-sized exporter who's trying to navigate that noodle bowl of different rules really struggles with that. And that's one of the benefits that multilaterals or plurilaterals have, is because you actually have that one set of rules that applies across all 11 countries in the case of a TPP 11 that people can comply with. And Gillian, the other point that I'd make too, because we get into the politics of all this, I need to get votes, right? I need to get re-elected to maintain my job. But we took a decision as a government about 3 years ago to stop all subsidies to our car industry. The car industry is a big factor, tens of thousands of workers. But we couldn't continue to justify subsidising an industry to the tune of $5 billion every 4 years to maintain it there. Now, what's the consequence of that? And this is why I talk about your frame of reference, your benchmark. By doing that, I know that the car fleet in Australia is going to become younger, which is better for road safety and public health costs and all those things. We don't need a car industry. We weren't competitive in it. Now we can focus on other areas where we have comparative advantage. And so the benefits, like always, are diverse, they're spread, and it's sort of small amounts over a large population base versus a lot of noise that comes from that small population base who are employed in the industry who complain the loudest, and that's the politics.
Right. Alejandro, I'm curious because, you don't need to be re-elected, but you are running a company which straddles borders. How would a renegotiation of NAFTA affect you potentially? And do you see problems in terms of unequal trade access between the US and Mexico in terms of the fields that you're operating in?
Well, our company operates cinemas, multiplexes in 13 countries. We have just over 5,000 screens, and we're the #2 film exhibitor in the world in terms of admissions. And 90% of the films that we show are American films, Hollywood films. So basically, if NAFTA, were repealed, and if we started a trade war between the U.S. and Mexico, Mexico is the fourth largest market in terms of movie admissions in the world, just after India, the U.S., and China. And obviously, one field where, the Mexican, government could retaliate would be raising, tariffs for, American cultural goods like films or like other things that we import from the U.S. to operate our cinemas. We import all the corn for our popcorn from the U.S., from Kansas and Iowa. We import all the amplifiers, all the servers, screens, popcorn warmers, the cheese for nachos. Mexico is, as you can imagine, the largest consumer of nachos in the world.
Whereas you are giving Mexican cinema goers nachos with American cheese.
Yeah, right. The cheese, we bring it from Wisconsin. And, so of course, a NAFTA...
That's a fact you didn't know, that if you go to Mexican cinemas, you're eating Wisconsin nachos.
That's right. So, and U.S. corn, popcorn, because it's Mexico does not produce the corn that has the right expansion for popcorn. So if there was a cancellation of NAFTA, for instance, it would be, for me, much cheaper to import the corn from Brazil or Argentina, because they do have equivalent corn to that produced in the Midwest.
You can't import Brad Pitt movies from Brazil, can you?
You can't, but you see, so I guess our company is a good example, of a NAFTA company. We have cinemas in the U.S. and Mexico, but also throughout Latin America and Spain, India, and again, I think one of the main American exports is cultural goods, music, films, TV series. And 90% of the films we show are American. So I think it depends on how the trade, if NAFTA were repealed, exactly where both countries would put new tariffs, and that's how it would affect us. And just one final point on your previous question about bilateral versus multilateral. I guess the main economic argument for multilateral is that you would include the most efficient producer of each good and service if it's a multilateral deal. If it's bilateral deals, you may be excluding the most efficient producers of a good. So it would be trade diversion rather than trade creation. So that's why it's better. Ideally, it would be better to have, under the WTO, a global multilateral deal. But we know that it's been stuck, since Doha. Nothing has happened. That's why, many regional blocs like, the Asia-Pacific region has started, to push for TPP. In Latin America, we have the Pacific Alliance between Mexico, Chile, Colombia, and Peru, and that's going very well. And we're further integrating our economy and lowering tariff barriers.
Right. So I'm curious, I'd like to ask each of you, if you were suddenly given a magic wand and allowed to become either, say, the President of the United States, Steve, or the President of Mexico, or the President of the WTO, what do you think business leaders need to do right now? What would you like to see happen over the next year? I mean, I guess for Steve, it would be rapid equalization. Is that the...
No, over the next year, it would be terrific to resolve most of the major issues. I think, NAFTA will be resolved in that kind of time frame. I think you'll have general agreement with China. It takes a long time to do trade agreements, right? So working them all out. But the basic outlines of things, I think it would be great to get all that behind us so we can move on to other things in life and just sort of have things be normalized.
So that's very encouraging. You think that NAFTA will be broadly renegotiated in the next year and a new trade deal with China will be done the next year?
I think we all have our own opinions. I'd be quite surprised if NAFTA isn't successfully renegotiated. And I think with China, there's a desire to for both countries to normalize trade relations and do it reasonably quickly if it's possible. So I'm optimistic on that, despite the sort of the rhetoric and other things of that type. I think it's in the interests of all of the countries involved in those discussions.
Alejandro, what would you like to see? Would you like to see a renegotiation, a speedy one? Or?
Yes, I would like to see a speedy renegotiation of the deal. Hopefully, have something done by the end of this year, mainly because Mexico has presidential elections in July of next year. So if this gets into the, our own political process, it would be messy. So for us, it would be ideal to get it done as soon as possible.
Right, the biggest service that can be done for NAFTA is is to have the Congress just release this, sort of document to authorize negotiations, because Mexican elections are coming up, and we could create our own problems as a group of 3 countries simply by a document being held up, which I think the administration wants to get going with this. This is really being held up by I won't say who, but
By part of Congress.
but it's not serving the purposes of the country or of Mexico in that regard.
Right. John and Brad, what would you like to see happen over the next year that would make you feel more encouraged?
I guess my focus would be without diminishing the importance of these public policy debates, I view public policy as a second-order effect of much more fundamental forces, and until and unless we address those, the public policy will go beyond our control. And the key thing for me is, what is our response to mounting performance pressure? I've spent a fair amount of time studying psychology in this area. There are many very human things we have when we respond to mounting pressure. Number one, we tend to maximize our perception of risk, discount our perception of reward. As we do that, we tend to shrink our time horizons. If we're under pressure, we can't afford to think about the future. We need to just think about today. And when you just think about today, you fall into what economists call a zero-sum view of the world. If it's all about today, the resources are given. The only question on the table is who's going to get them, you or me? And the consequence of that is erosion of trust. You may seem like a really nice person, but I know at the end of the day, only one of us is going to get these resources, and it's going to be me. And in that kind of environment, we are headed towards a very dysfunctional society. And my belief, and key issue that I see, is that, at least in the US, both sides of the political spectrum have fallen on what I call a threat-based narrative. We are under attack. The enemy is coming at us. We're all going to die. We got to come together and fight now. Threat-based narratives reinforce all those dysfunctional psychological reactions to mounting pressure. Until and unless we can frame an opportunity-based narrative, that it gives a credible view of an opportunity that if we can come together, we can all benefit from that opportunity, our public policy is going to head in a very dysfunctional direction.
And do you see any countries framing it in that way at the moment?
No.
Okay. Brad, what would you like to do if you were suddenly president tomorrow? What would you like to see happen?
What I would like to see, since I won't be president, I'd say that what I hope for is that as little as possible gets broken and as much knowledge as possible gets acquired. Already we have had President Trump say that when he spoke last during the campaign about how NATO was obsolete, he did not know what he was talking about, and that indeed NATO is not obsolete and is rather the pillar of security of the Western Alliance. I would like Donald Trump to say that when he said that the TPP was a job-destroying trade deal that would rob America of manufacturing jobs, as he did last fall, that he did not know what he was talking about, and that the TPP was actually something that would further strengthen market integration across the Pacific, and that in fact the United States had struck a very good deal in terms of intellectual property with countries elsewhere in the TPP. So much so that when I was kind of neutral, tending toward no on the TPP, it was largely because I did not think it was fair that the Vietnamese should be charged for pharmaceuticals what TPP was going to charge them. That they're poor, we bombed them for 10 years. We could at least let them get pharmaceuticals relatively cheaply. And of course, the best of all possible worlds is one in which people realize that a free trade agreement is a free trade agreement. There are no tariff barriers there. There's really nothing to renegotiate. there are no substantial issues. The only issues, as I said, I'm aware of in NAFTA to possibly be renegotiated are the fact that the United States has been consistently in violation of its NAFTA treaty obligations to Canada with respect to lumber imports over the past 25 years, that I believe the United States is still in violation of its NAFTA obligations with respect to trucking and transport, right, service imports from Mexico, letting Mexican trucks in.
But what about
the third, of course, is the Canadian cultural thing. Lenny Kravitz, Celine Dion, and so forth. Should we let Hollywood wipe them off of the Canadian airwaves?
But when Secretary Ross suddenly makes lumber and milk a key trade issue, is that justified, do you think, under the terms of NAFTA, or is that just plucked out of thin air?
That's just plucked out of thin air, I think. Admittedly, there have been a long time a lot of congressmen and senators in the northern tier of the United States have been upset. I remember a conversation with one of the Dakota Democratic senators' chiefs of staff in the buffet line at the Federal Reserve's Jackson Hole conference about how is it really worth trying to take a stand here on these issues. And their response was, yes, we have a lot of lumber and cheese producers who we want to protect. That's the kind of thing that we tried to get away with free trade. Tried to have agreements that were simple, comprehensive, multilateral, grew the global economy, and so even the losers could say, well, the spillovers from faster and bigger economic growth will in fact make it worthwhile for us in 5 years, even if it's going to be a shock now. And if you turn that in reverse, well, we know how that happens too, right? That every year I teach the spider diagram from Charlie Kindleberger's The World in Depression of the collapse of world trade during the Great Depression.
I mean, the chart that you put up there showing globalization going up like a rocket, have you tried to calculate what that has added to GDP and stuff? I mean, how serious would it be for global growth if, say, more protectionism does come in?
There are two views. One view is that trade leads to big redistributions and to big movements in goods and services across borders. But that in fact, if everything had to be produced at home, things wouldn't go up in price by all that much. That Australia could run an automobile industry without giving, but at current free trade prices, you have to provide something like 30% subsidies. So you'd have 30% less productivity in something like the 10% of the economy that's value, right, that's domestic, that's foreign value, manufacturing value added. Say a 3% hit to the world economy as a whole. And you can say 3%, that's not very much, but then world GDP of 80 trillion, 3% of that, that's 240 billion a year kind of lost to the world. And we don't have a world, although you might not know it in this room, in this hotel, at this conference, but we're in a world that is not terribly rich. We're in a world where a quarter of our fellow humans still live like our pre-industrial ancestors, save for their cell phones, their access to cell phones, with fear about where the food is going to come from next week, and where only about a tenth of the world has what those of us in this room would overwhelmingly regard as a normal standard of living. And so that 240 billion a year of lost production, that would be seriously felt by a lot of people. It's not enough to derange an economy or grossly destabilize asset prices. But there are a lot of people out there whom it would hurt.
Steve, when you look at what Australia can and can't do, I mean, as far as you're concerned, it's just business as usual, is it? That you keep trying to press ahead with TPP? Or is there anything else you think that you can do to try and promote more globalization?
One of the perverse outcomes of this global discussion around the benefits and the losses associated with globalization has been and empowering of advocacy about pro-globalisation. Maybe I feel it more keenly than others, but it's sort of, in an Australian context, myself, other members of the government that I'm a member of, are emboldened to champion the benefits of trade. So, when we feel that we're under siege, we've got to talk about history. We've got to talk about the fact that from the 1960s onwards, trade growth was about double the pace of real GDP growth. We know that trade drives growth. We know that trade drives jobs. And so, I will use illustration after illustration, talking about companies, businesses, and others that are benefiting from us opening up export markets. And the challenge is, and this may not be a uniform media environment globally, but often it is, they'll always put the factory closure on the front page and talk about how many workers have lost their jobs, but they will never put on the front page the fact that business X has now expanded their plant, or business Y is now employing an extra 200 people to meet international orders. And we just have to be realistic. The world is more global than it has ever been. Labour is global, capital is global. We are kidding ourselves if we don't appreciate that for the generations coming through now. National boundaries, especially in the Western world, mean less than they've ever met before. So that's that is what we need to tap into.
So when you look ahead in a couple of years' time, do you think you'll be operating in a climate of more protectionism or less protectionism?
Well, if we're operating in an environment of more protectionism in a decade's time, then we're all going to be more impoverished. Full stop.
What about you, Brad? Do you think we're going to be having more protectionism in a couple of years' time?
I think yes. I don't think we'll have significantly more. But I think that the secular stagnation issues, the fact that governments are unwilling to increase their purchases, that central banks have pushed the pedal to the floor and are largely out of gas, no matter what they say in public, means enough governments will say we have to pull the lever to raise trade barriers to attract jobs back, that there'll be some increase in protectionism. And there will also be some reduction in intercontinental value chains, that Nike will bring production back from Vietnam to outside of Boston, if only because it has now figured out robots that can sew shoes, which was always the problem before, because since leather is flexible, robots have an easy time with rigid materials like steel and plastic, but a very hard time with flexible ones. They're now getting it. And so combine something like the coming of the robots being something like mass production in producing reshoring, with the aggregate demand and secular stagnation pressures, with the burbling underlying political pressures by which lots of people feel that something's going wrong. Lots of politicians are looking for something to blame, and the best person to blame is someone who does not vote in your elections.
Right.
That's an easy way to go,
right,
whether it is true or not.
John, do you expect more protectionism? Less?
In the short term, I do expect more protectionism, but again, as an optimist, I do view it as a catalyst to force us to reassess our institutions. And broadly, the shift that we see that we need to make is move from institutions, and I'm not just talking about companies, but all institutions, that are driven today by a model of scalable efficiency, thank you, Ronald Coase, to a model of scalable learning that will help all of us to learn faster and achieve much more of our potential, and that ultimately will break us back into more of a globalized mindset.
Right. Well, trust the Silicon Valley voice to be optimistic. Silver linings. Alejandro, more or less protectionism in a couple of years' time?
I think in the short term, perhaps slightly more at the global level, but I think I'm also an optimist, and I would hope that we will see less protectionism after, maybe this time that is a little bit turbulent. But I think Mexico, for instance, is trying to open up or strengthen current trade deals with other parts of the world. 80% of our bilateral trade is with the US, so we're also trying to strengthen our relationships with Latin America, modernize and deepen our free trade agreement with the European Union and strengthen our commercial relations with the Asia-Pacific Rim. So my hope is that we continue to see less protectionism.
Right. Steve, I've chucked plenty of hard questions at you. It seems only fair to let you have the last word.
Geez,
More protectionism or less?
I don't know whether I wanted the first word or I want the last word.
Well, you can have both.
But I think you'll probably see, in a historical context, little more. But this is like a cycle that I think we're going through. And once you get through this cycle, you'll have a new baseline and you'll move on to other things. I think that John is absolutely right that this is just one part of a very complex set of circumstances with technology, a leader in terms of putting pressure on governments and people, and trade gets mixed up with that to some degree, as does to other types of political factors. And we're going to, as a society, have to work our way through these things and find a way to deal with technology and with education, which, at least in the United States, since we just happened to be at a conference in the United States, has steadily been declining. And we're now number 27 in the world. You can't deal with important issues like technology putting pressure on whether it's margins, returns, job creation, expressed through different types of unhappiness with trade and other things, unless we solve, sort of the educational aspect. We used to be in the top 3 in the world. This is a remarkable achievement in 35 years to get to number 27. And if you don't address that, this won't be the only panel that's got not completely cheerful things to talk about.
Right. Well, I think that's a way of saying, I think the clear consensus is, by about 4.5 votes, short-term pessimism. You need to get elected, so you can't be short-term pessimistic. But medium to long-term hopes for optimism, hopes that this is a cycle. That rocket diagram graph that Brad presented is certainly one quite optimistic framing. Let's hope that the rocket keeps going up. But anyway, thank you all very much indeed for your time, and best of luck.